gentlemen, this session is called Why Go Into Space? Indeed. And my name is Dr. Phil Lapp. My background in space goes back to the early days of the space program, even prior to Sputnik, but at the Havilland aircraft, where we developed the space frame for the Alouette and ISDC series of satellites. Later on, I was one of the group that helped form Spar Aerospace in 1968, starting in 1968. And I've been involved with Spar ever since, not as an employee, but as a director of the company. And through Spar, I've developed a consulting practice in the space area, and I've been involved in a number of studies since that time, but I still continue my connection with Spar. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. I'm sorry we're starting a little late. We have five very distinguished panelists to hear from this morning. I've asked them to take about 10 minutes to express their views on the matter of why go into space. And then I'll open it up for discussion. But because of the truncation of our time frame here, I have to be sure that we are finished by 12 noon. And so we are not going to have as much discussion as I'd like to have had otherwise. However, I think we can still get something quite helpful and useful to you in the next hour and a quarter or so. Now, what I plan to do is to introduce quickly who the panelists are, and then give you a little bit of their background as they each come up to speak. The first panelist will be Ken Money, and he's sitting on the far right. They even might be sitting in proper order, not quite, but close. Next to Ken is in the program and on the stage is Michael Fulda. And again, as I say, I'll introduce these speakers to you momentarily. Third is Leonard David. The fourth is Tom Harris, who you heard in the last session. And the final speaker is Charlie Walker. Now, I will, as I say, introduce them more formally as they get up to speak. What I would like to say, however, I'll take the prerogative of the chairman and take about 3 minutes just to give some of my own views, because this is probably my only chance. And I thought I probably ought to start by saying that with my limited vision, I saw four major reasons why one might want to go into space. And I list them as follows: a commercial reason, which is the one that I identify with particularly, scientific reasons, political reasons, and social reasons. And I would say that in most space programs there is some mixture of all of those, one way or the other. I'd like to say a few words about commercial applications, because I don't know if there are other panelists who will deal with this subject, since I haven't been privy to their plans for what they're going to say. First and foremost is communications. So far, it is the only activity that has shown a financial return outside of technological contractors and suppliers of space hardware and space software, which of course is a thriving industry in many countries. Satellite communications are now so pervasive that I don't need to go into any detail. An entire industry has developed around space communications, which is now moving to become seamlessly integrated with the telephone networks of the world, and soon will be central to the emerging personal communication systems which we will all be carrying in our hip pocket before the turn of the century. The second major commercial area, which is not yet showing financial return, is Earth observation from space, or as most of it call it, remote sensing. And that really is a subset of the general field of geographic information systems, of which it has been becoming an essential component both from space and from aircraft. Currently, Landsat, which is US, optical satellite, Spot, French optical satellite, somewhat competing with Landsat, and the first radar satellite, ERS-1, are civilian remote satellites that are pioneering examples. Of course, the military have had remote sensing satellites for many, many years with much higher resolution than these satellites, which range from 10 to 30 meters in resolution. Canada's RadarSat, incidentally, I'm also the chair of RadarSat International, which is marketing remote sensing data from space in Canada. And Canada's RadarSat is to be launched early next year on the assumption that the Cabinet, which met yesterday, passed the long-term space plan too. Maybe people in this audience that know whether it did or not, and I'm still in the dark about that. This will be the first operational remote sensing satellite, which should pave the way to profitability. And in fact, we see RadarSat 1, as we're calling it now, a precursor to a follow-on RadarSat 2, much like the Landsat and Spot series. But as we move up in the series of RadarSats, we will see increasingly private contribution, private investment, not just in the ground segment, which is the case today, but also in the space segment. And by the time we've passed the turn of the century and into the first decade of the 2000th century, we will see remote sensing satellites become totally self-sufficient. And that's an opinion, not a fact, of course. So this gradual shift from public to private investment will occur over the next decade. Other commercial applications include the use of satellites in positioning and navigation, sometimes known as RDSS. I can't even remember what it stands for now. The best example being the Global Positioning System, GPS, which presently is being controlled, as any of you who use it know, by the U.S. military, although other purely commercial systems are in the planning stages, and one, in fact, is operating by the Russians. Materials processing in space, where some of our panelists have in-depth experience, I'm sure we'll hear more about that, certainly shows some promise, but it's my view, and we can argue this in this discussion, that it's likely a long way from commercial self-sufficiency. And by that I mean, what are the total cost of the processing, including the launch and the spacecraft is privately funded. There, I'm sure, are other commercial applications that I've omitted. I leave them to the discussion period that follows brief presentations from our panel members. So now what I'd like to do is to introduce our first panelist, very distinguished Canadian astronaut, Dr. Ken Money. Ken received his bachelor's degree in physiology and biochemistry, a master's in physiology, and a PhD in physiology from the University of Toronto. He's a pilot in propeller and jet aircraft, and also flies helicopters. He's an Olympic-class athlete, being a member of Canada's track and field team in Melbourne, Australia in 1956. And he won the American Masters Badminton Championship in Miami in 1989. So he's a multi-threat man. A member of many scientific societies and recipient of a wide array of honors, Ken became a senior scientist at the Defense and Civil Institute of Environmental Medicine of the Department of National Defense in Canada. His work there, which began in 1961, has been in vestibular physiology with more than 90 scientific publications to his credit. His work in motion sickness and pilot disorientation resulted in the Malcolm Horizon, an instrument which is commercialized, and since 1962 he has worked with NASA scientists in those areas and a co-investigator in the vestibular experiments on Space Lab 1, D1, SLS-1, 41G, the IML-1 missions. He is one of the 6 Canadian astronauts selected in December of 1983, and in 1992 on the IML-1 Space Lab mission, STS-42, he was operations radio communicator and the backup astronaut later on for Dr. Roberta Bondar. Dr. Money left the Canadian Space Agency in July of '92 to return to DCIEM, where he is currently involved in pilot disorientation research and space science. Ken will appear in this program again at the semi-plenary, 9 o'clock on Saturday morning in this room, the Neptune room, on the subject of life science aspects of the manned mission to Mars. Also at 2 p.m. Sunday in Jupiter 1. Ken Money.
Well, thank you, Phil. Now that I've heard who I am, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. We have, as you know, just a very short time each, so I will be brief. as King Henry VIII of England said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. I think you're all aware that a couple of years back, there was a cancellation of space station by the House Appropriations Committee in the United States, and the mission had to be resurrected by determined efforts from the administration. And it was only because we had three very powerful people, very well located, that were very much with us, that we managed to get space station reinstated. And those three people, of course, were President Bush, who was from Texas, and a space enthusiast, Vice President Quayle, who had three teenagers who were keen on space, and he was also in charge of the space program. And President Bush's Chief of Staff, John Sununu, got his PhD on a NASA fellowship. And it was only because of these three people that space station is still with us today. And last year, June 22nd, you're probably aware, space station survived by only one vote in the House of Representatives, its annual refunding. So we can see that things are touch and go, and there's perhaps nothing more important, more urgent for the space program, and especially the manned space program, than a good answer to the question, why? Why do we want to go into space? And of course, the manned space efforts are inseparable from the unmanned. We only have to think of the repair of the Hubble Space Telescope to be convinced of that. To my mind, there are 6 reasons that space agencies exist, and 6 reasons why we go into space. I'll list them briefly and comment on 1 or 2 of them. First of all, there are the practical things, the communication satellites, the Earth observers, and materials processing. Then we have exploration and adventure. The third thing is the answering of fundamental questions. The fourth thing is the influence on youth and other sociological influences of space activities. The fourth thing is the provision of symbols of technological excellence. And the sixth thing is the development of high-tech industry and employment. And along with that, of course, there's a return to governments. Governments get back much more, or have in the past at least got back much more in savings and in taxes than they ever put into space. At least that's the case here in Canada. I think Phil has said quite a lot about development of high-tech industry and employment. I'll leave that. And the symbols of technological excellence, of course, this was the very basis of the American space program during the competition with the Soviet Union. And it was a major motivation, a major reason why we've now lost that motivation, and the others are what we're going on. I think the exploration and adventure is also quite clear and a major part of the influence on youth and the other sociological influences. And perhaps the other speakers are going to touch on these. If there's something that doesn't fall into these 6 categories, I hope someone will point it out, or if there's something that you know of, some reason why that we're not thinking of, other than these 6, please let us know, because I'd like to know all the reasons and have the list in order to help convince the politicians that we should, in fact, continue. The one that perhaps others won't talk about is the answering of fundamental questions, which is something that space agencies do. These are the questions that children often ask. They ask repeatedly until they learn to stop asking because the answers are not satisfying. And then the same questions are asked again in first-year university. And these are the questions such as, where did the world come from? Where did the stars come from? And where did the first mother come from? These fundamental questions were at one time forbidden. And if you just think back briefly to, well, not so briefly, I guess, 1592 was when Galileo got fired from the University of Pisa for political incorrectness. Back in 1592, the Aristotelians on staff at the University of Pisa were very powerful. They would wear clothes that Aristotle would wear, of that fashion anyway, 900 years old at that time even. They would teach that whatever Aristotle had said was absolute truth, and they demanded that people show respect to that point of view and to them in their fancy clothes. And of course, Galileo thought that was pretty funny. He made fun of them when he was fired. So then he had to go and compete for a job as a professor of mathematics at the University of Padua. And in competition with him at the University of Padua for that job was a chap called Giordano Bruno. Maybe some of you have heard of Bruno. He did not win the competition, and in fact, that wasn't his best year because in 1592 he was thrown in jail. His crime was teaching that the Earth rotates on its axis and that the world is in orbit around the sun. He went further. He taught students, classrooms full of students, he taught that there were, in fact, hundreds of Earths and countless suns in the universe. And for that he was kept in jail 8 years. Finally, in 1600, he was taken from jail and dragged to the Piazza Campo dei Fiori in Rome, where he was tied to an iron stake. And his tongue was torn out and he was burned alive. It's just wonderful to think of the progress that we've made since then, because in 1989, NASA launched COBE satellite basically to confirm the existence, the historical reality of the Big Bang. And although, for some reason, the journalists have not treated us to accounts of just how important this experiment was, the COBE satellite experiments were described by Stephen Hawking as the most important experiments that have ever been done. And these experiments, in fact, recorded in detail the leftover radiation from the Big Bang, confirming that, in fact, the Big Bang occurred. So we humans have changed from burning alive people who ask these fundamental questions. We've changed to people who now fund the expensive investigations of these people, and in fact provide them with expensive things such as COBE satellites. So I think the answering the fundamental questions is perhaps one of the important reasons why. There are at least 5 others, and we hope that we'll hear about all of them here today.
Thank you very much, Ken. Our second speaker is Dr. Michael Fulda. Dr. Fulda is Professor of Political Science at Fairmont State College, West Virginia, where he regularly teaches a class in state policy. He's a campus representative of the West Virginia Space Grants Consortium and campus organizer of its elementary school space education research program. Dr. Fulda is also the president of the Institute for the Social Science Study of Space, whose educational activities include the preparation of remote sensing modules for K-12 science and social science studies classes. Dr. Fulda is past director of the NSS and recipient of the 1993 Spaceback Outstanding Service Award. Governor appointed delegate to the Aerospace States Association, associate fellow of the AIAA, a member of its public policy committee, and member of a number of other space organizations. He recently testified in Congress on U.S.-Russian cooperation in the human space program. Dr. Fulda will appear on a panel at 5 p.m. Sunday in the Jupiter 2 room on the subject of From Russia with Contracts. Dr. Fulda.
Thank you so much. First thing, on a number of occasions over the years where I've heard Canadian officials address a U.S. audience, at least in the United States, invariably after their salutation in English, they repeated in French. And I thought, gee, that's neat. Next time, the first time I'm in Canada, I'm going to do the same thing. So, mesdames et messieurs, je suis enchanté d'être ici à Toronto et je suis sûr que je suis entre amis. There, I did it. It wasn't really for the applause, it was for my own gratification. I'm speaking here as both a political scientist who now then teaches space policy, as a political activist, and also as a president of the Institute for the Social Science Study of Space. Now, when I saw the question of this panel, why go to space? Why not? It's a cosmic question, really. Cosmic, not only in the sense that it's in heaven, but also in its amplitude. And it occurred to me that probably if we were to ask this audience of why it is that here, as members of the MSS, we are here, what are the reasons that we want to go to space and why are we here, that it probably would not involve most of the rationalizations which we hear, which is commercialization and communication, industrialization, etc., etc. The reasons, I'm sure, are deeper and psychological, some almost Alsace religion. And that, of course, is the problem with the state of the space program then and now. Simply put, it doesn't pass the giggle test. It is so sublime that one is afraid of the step of going, there's only one step from the sublime to the ridiculous. And many of the rationalizations that we find for space are in effect, the justifications are in effect rationalizations for audiences and for groups that do not share our point of view. Just think of it. The Space Exploration Initiative, the SEI, was boldly put forward by President Bush and then practically hidden away in Congress. And I would submit that it's not that the reason it was done was not so much because most congressmen wouldn't agree that the steps that were proposed, very simple, enabling steps over the years and the decades, weren't sensible. I expect that most members of the Congress wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a sensible and not sensible step. But the idea was that no, you could not have that in the budget. You could not be accused of seeming to endorse something frivolous. And thus the perfect willingness at some time of taking those funds and of masking them under something else, as long as it didn't sound that that particular congressman or senator would in effect have approved of such a budget item, one that conceivably could be used during a campaign negative commercials against him. If we look at the reasons, not for going for space, but say the most controversial part, and that is the space station in its various configurations. And we look essentially what President Clinton has said, why go to space, or in that case to the space station? His answers essentially are what? Conversion. It's a great thing to show that we can convert the military industry to peaceful endeavors. Competitiveness. Everything must be viewed within the cycle of competitiveness. And then, as we know, as of lately, foreign policy. And that is as the instrument to bind the Russians in one particular area where we can do that as equals. And then I believe somewhere in the speech where sort of the usual psychological well-being, because after all we must go there because it's there, or what have you. Oh yes, and Chelsea likes it. again, what we see here are rationalizations which are put forth because one is concerned about not passing the frivolous test, and especially if it implies a large amount of money. How do all these big principles come together at the legislative nuts and bolts stage? Let me just give you one example, and then words of our predecessor, I will not keep you long. I'm from Fairmont, West Virginia, which for you who are Americans here, you may be aware that West Virginia is the fiefdom of one Senator Robert C. Byrd, head of the Appropriations Committee, our guardian angel we call him, and, or patron saint occasionally. And next week we are opening up a brand new NASA installation in my own hometown. 20,000 population. This is Christmas in June. Our House member, who represents our district, happens to be on the subcommittee, on the Committee of Appropriations, and worked himself up the ladder on 2 subcommittees. As of now, he's informally the chair of Commerce, State, and something else. More specifically, he's now number 2 on the subcommittee that funds NASA and EPA and NSF, et cetera, et cetera. We're together at a space education opportunity, and I asked him, listen, interesting now that you are head of that other subcommittee and almost number 2 on this one, how do you combine these? I'm sure there must be. And yes, suddenly he waxed enthusiastically and said, yes, there are a whole number of issues in his committee, commerce, which with competitiveness, which certainly have an impact on the other independent agencies, specifically NASA, and he started telling how, in effect, he would insist from the position of his 2 powers to see to it that NASA projects and programs would have a high element of industrial competitiveness in them. And I asked him how he planned to do that. He said he wasn't sure, but his staff was working on it. So don't be surprised if we find that the space station or a number of other programs, to the extent that they're funded by the US government, will now have a strong component of let's not just go to space, let's go to space and also do something else. And of course, that is one of the problems. Let's conclude with the one of the old statements, which is, when will we get to the moon or to the Mars? And the answer was 10 years after people stopped laughing.
Thank you very much, Michael. Our third speaker this morning is Mr. Leonard David, who is editor of Final Frontier magazine. He was a former editor of Space World and Ad Astra magazines. Correspondent for Space News newspaper and Sci-Fi Channel. As a space writer, his articles have appeared in Astronomy, Omni, Sky and Telescope, and numerous space-related publications. He is founding member of the Mars Underground, and at this meeting he's going to appear on 5 p.m. Friday in the Saturn 1 room on Mars Track, the publicity of the manned mission to Mars, and at 5 p.m. on Saturday in the Neptune room, this room, NASA's Countdown to Nowhere, Lower Expectations. Mr. Leonard David.
Well, you told me what I was doing. I wasn't quite sure of all those things. It's funny, writing is a passion of mine. I've been writing about space for a long time, but when you do get asked a question, why go into space, you go to this, I think that's what strikes me about this kind of panel. The very fact that we're asking that question, why go into space, and we've been doing this for 35 years, and somehow the collective answer to that question is still missing, and we're all in this room today to try to look at each other and say, well, somebody tell us something that I can go home and use to tell other people why go into space. So that's my first sort of pessimistic thought about a panel like this. We have to ask that question after so many years of exploration. So clearly, we're in a kind of cool hand Luke phenomenon, which is what we have here is a failure to communicate. We're not sure what we're doing, and the public is not sure what we're doing. So I guess there's sort of a warning that comes with my view of why we go into space, and that is that we all have to do a much better job of communicating many of the thoughts that are going to come out of this panel. It's clear that we've got a space program after 35 years that's almost a Rorschach test. You can look at it a lot of different ways. You can see a lot of different activities that are very viable and very important. Be they applications or on the larger vision of space exploration of humans. And I guess that's one of the problems that I've seen over the years of working with space advocacy groups is that collectively the people, all of us, and we're all sort of here together in this particular setting, but we're sort of all gathered in one room on the Earth, and there's probably a total of 100,000 people that belong to these space advocacy groups. So we've got a lot of work to do to communicate whatever it is we believe individually or collectively as a whole to a much larger audience of American and the world public. So with those little caveats, this Rorschach test, I agree with, it's easy to agree with everybody because I think everybody's right. Space can be looked upon as an applications-oriented program. We can certainly monitor the Earth. We can, the military can look at it as the high ground. That's why they want to go into space. You've got to protect the national security of the country. Clearly, the Earth environment issue is one that's more dominant because our theme of the decade is save the planet or let's make sure that we're not going to go under as a collective ecosystem. I caution that particular Earth environment message is one that has a little bit of a schizophrenic message to me, and that the space program and why I've gotten interested in over the years was the fact that the space program delivered a success. It delivered an achievement. It delivered on what a promise was, whether it's a moon landing that landed at 9:34 and 26 seconds, or a Mars mission from the Viking that landed precisely on time. There is no time for a mission to Earth to tell you that hey, we just succeeded in saving the Earth. So if NASA, the American space program, if NASA is to be the theme holder of saving the planet Earth, it is certainly a shift away from what I think certain people expect as far as space programs and delivering an achievement. We got a lot of agencies around this country other than NASA that should be handling missions of planet Earth. So why go into space? I don't know. For me, I think it's mostly what I find myself gravitating to. It's certainly the search for inner life and outer life. Space program provides an opportunity to be introspective about our own inventory of self-worth. And society as a whole reflects that collectively again in the space program. And I do believe when the space program is on the skids, I think the larger political scene, social context of human evolution is also in a precarious predicament. I guess maybe I'll close with something I've written for a while back, but if we as a species are fortunate, our evolution in the cosmos at large will have started by migrating from Earth to the highlands of the Moon and to the plains of Mars. Of course, the task ahead is not without danger. Opening up the solar system to human habitation will mean sacrifices, failures, accidents, and death. These earliest of space pioneers who chart the uncharted are homesteading new frontiers. And I do believe that that's the basic premise behind why go into space. It is the evolution of the species off the planet to a much larger context, a cosmological context. And while we do that, we also understand more about the universe at large and who else is out there that also is dealing in conference rooms today, trying to understand why go into space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Our fourth speaker this morning is no stranger to this room. He was the speaker in the first session, Tom Harris. Tom runs a business as a professional speaker in space exploration and environment. Over the years, he's given presentations to audiences of all ages and backgrounds, from groups of young children to aerospace professionals. He's also lectured at the National Museum of Science and Technology in Ottawa as part of their evening astronomy program. In addition to his speaking, Tom has had space-related feature articles published in major Canadian newspapers. One of these articles is included in your handout package. Tom has both bachelor and master's degrees in mechanical engineering and worked as an aerospace engineer, primarily in propulsion systems, for about 10 years before starting the speaking business. Like many of us, Tom believes that the human expansion into space is a critical key to the development of a healthy, positive future. While he agrees with the standard justification for the space program, he has recently found that anthropologists and other social scientists had some extraordinary things to tell us about the relevance of space exploration to humanity's future. He'll be sharing some of his findings with us this morning. And I might add that Tom has already spoken in the first session in this room into space and into oblivion, which some of you, I'm sure, have attended. Tom Harris.
Into space or into oblivion. Hopefully we're not going into space to go into oblivion. It's one or the other, in my opinion. Thank you, Phil. And once again, good morning. Since most of you have already heard me speak, I'll be fairly brief. As I explained this morning, I believe that the real reasons for human spaceflight have more to do with social science than the standard justifications that we hear from the various space agencies. As Ken was mentioning, the standard justifications are primarily technological spin-offs, job and wealth creation, scientific advances, and of course the enhancement to national prestige. Now it's interesting that though these are unquestionably real benefits, anthropologists and historians are saying more and more that even if these benefits did not exist, we would still be moving into space, or at least we should be moving into space because this is important to our future. Whether it actually happens, of course, remains to be seen. Both anthropologists and historians, as I say, come to the same conclusion, but they do it from a different direction. And as I said before, there is a considerable debate, and an important debate, not just academic, which discusses whether the drive to explore is genetic or cultural. You actually market the program quite differently depending on which it is. This morning I focused on four main reasons that I think are not being emphasized enough in the various space agencies and other space advocates when they promote the program. The first factor, these are all social science factors, the first factor refers to what is called the founder effect. And as I explained this morning, the first person that I'm aware of who spoke about this was Robert Heinlein several decades ago. Basically, this talks about the fact that as we move into space, as the various waves of humanity move further out, we'll see an exaggeration or an increase in certain characteristics. These are characteristics that we certainly need today, things like environmental awareness and systems consciousness. This kind of evolution of human consciousness is pointed out by anthropologists as the principal benefit of our movement into space. The second benefit, which as I just discussed, is satisfaction of the drive to explore. Anthropologists and historians both say that satisfaction of this drive is a crucial element of our future and something that we thwart at our peril. The third reason is that it is important that certain segments of our human society be out of instantaneous contact with the rest of our species. Because of advances in transportation and communication, the information superhighway, for example, may eventually extend worldwide, and of course communication satellites. We're seeing the homogenization of worldwide culture as a result of instantaneous communication. Historians are maintaining that it's very important that we recognize this is unique in human history. Never before have we had almost instantaneous communication around the world. And they also maintain that to allow our cultural and intellectual advancement, we should have some pockets of humanity who are separate from the bulk. So they can try out new things, which back on Earth we may very well say, ooh, that's not politically correct, like genetic engineering. These small colonies, these small groups of human settlement may try out things which eventually can help us back on the Earth, which we may be afraid to try. And finally, and most importantly, the envision of a positive future, technological and human developments, this allows us to feel better today about tomorrow's world. Obviously, tomorrow's world will be better if we have a positive vision of the future. But especially for children, it's important that they think there is something worth living for. And certainly that's why I believe that perhaps one of the biggest advantages of the space program is that it offers us an alternative, positive vision of the future. Now, I believe that if space advocates don't soon start to use these arguments more forcefully in trying to market the program, that we may very well find that the era of space exploration ends before this decade is over. It's interesting that people like James Spinaro, an anthropologist in California, Charles Laughlin, another anthropologist in Ottawa, an historian by the name of Stephen Pine, they all maintain that if NASA and other groups don't use these human-centered arguments very soon, that the program will probably not last much longer. For those of us who are already space activists, let's not allow the current trend for political correctness to prevent us from making the very strong and forceful arguments that we have to make to see this program expand. As I explained in my presentation this morning, space exploration offers some truly incredible benefits for mankind if we dare to dream boldly and, to quote a phrase, to make it so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Our fifth and final panelist this morning is Charles D. Walker. Charlie Walker was the first non-career industry-sponsored U.S. astronaut serving as payload specialist on Space Shuttle missions STS-12 in September of '84, 16 and '85, and STS-23 in November of '85. On those flights, Walker operated equipment designed by McDonnell Douglas Astronautics Company for its electrophoresis biotechnology commercialization program, known as EOS, and accumulated 20 days and 8.2 million miles of space flight experience. The EOS device, developed under a joint agreement between McDonnell Douglas and NASA, produced large, pure quantities of pharmaceuticals when operated in the weightlessness of space. As chief test engineer of the EOS program, Walker was extensively involved in the laboratory development and spaceflight test of the EOS device. Walker has also been responsible for training NASA astronauts in the operation of this device. Walker, who is presently Senior Manager for Space Programs Development at McDonnell Douglas Space Systems Company, joined that company in 1977. Currently in Washington, D.C., Walker is supporting McDonnell Douglas on technical and policy issues. He currently serves on several government and university research center panels and is an advisor to the Challenger Center for Space Science Education. A native of Bedford, Indiana, Walker received his undergraduate degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Purdue University in '71. He was awarded an honorary Doctor of Science degree from St. Louis College of Pharmacy in 1985. Prior to joining McDonnell Douglas, Walker was a project engineer with the Naval Sea Weapons Systems Command and computer-controlled manufacturing systems, design engineer for Bendix Aerospace, and previous to that, an engineering technician and firefighter with the U.S. Forest Service. Charlie Walker will be appearing at the semi-plenary on the road to space at 9 a.m. on Saturday in this room. Charles Walker.
Thank you very much, Bill, and let me also add that it's my great pleasure to be back in Canada and to be in Toronto with you at this ISDC. It's something I look forward to every year, very positively so. This year more than ever because it's the first Space Development Conference of the National Space Society outside of those United States and out into the larger and real world that we're all stuck to for the time being. I've got a real challenge this morning. It comes to those who are at the end of a fairly long line of distinguished individuals providing you with a lot of very good input on the subject at hand. My challenge is to keep you awake by telling you something that hopefully will be different than what you've heard already. That is, as one of America's foremost philosophers, Pogo, put it, is almost an insurmountable opportunity. But I hope to have the satisfaction of having you be greatly relieved and very smiley at knowing that when I'm done, that's the last of us, and then you can have at us. The question why is an extremely important question. That's almost an anti-introduction. You know that, we all know that, and as Ken has already said, I found it very interesting that Ken made a statement, an analogy that I also made in my notes preliminary to this presentation, that why is a question, it's almost the first question, it's also almost all of the questions that young children ask. It is so because all of us, when we come down to it, are inquiring at various levels. We are inquiring intellects, and we want to know why. It provides not only stimulation, but it provides satisfaction. Not only the asking, but most often, and hopefully positively, the answers. As a child matures, that simple question asked continues to be asked, but in fact the inquiry continues into the world around us as that child matures into a mature adult. Historian in the U.S., historian Dan Gorston said that we humans are discoverers with a need to know what is out there. I think it is, in fact, a need that we have. And I, in my meager effort in answering this question posed to us today, characterize a response in three categories. And I think these categories hold sway over individuals, over political systems, and over cultures at different times and to different degrees. The three needs, as I saw them, were categorized as psychological, material, and basic survival. We've already heard a little bit about the psychological. So I would just add my words that, in my view, the psychological begins with, in fact, the individual need to experience, to achieve, and the individual need for power, some degree of control over ourselves and our surroundings. Now, this need equates in our societies and our cultures to both individual actions, to corporate actions, and to the actions by states and nation states. Consider what an achievement, what an experience it is to leave your home or your home planet. That is a significant achievement, and it is one that provides satisfaction to a significant personal need. But in fact, more than that, because look at how great it is to be recognized to be from a country that has achieved spaceflight. I think Canada knows that. Perhaps, most likely, not as significantly as Americans did, and Americans particularly 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago. I mean, there are stories that abound of individual U.S. citizens being stopped in airports or on the streets of cities around the world on the 20th or the 21st of July. People stopping them and saying, are you American? Congratulations. It is wonderful what you have done. you have put humanity on another world. Everyone recognized that, and everyone felt a gross satisfaction from that event and that achievement, at much more than just an individual level. How much power and how much leadership is demonstrated by a country that does that? A lot. It overcomes boundaries. It provides satisfactions that we don't achieve virtually any other way. And perhaps in the exploration of space, each of us feels that a part of us has reached the heavens. We've heard some words already that speak to the sublime, perhaps the spiritual nature of the adventure, the outreach, the exploration of this region beyond the Earth that we call outer space. I think Buzz Aldrin perhaps put it best when he said that space flight lifts the human spirit. Then there is the material need to explore space. Though not intuitively obvious, I think as the psychological needs, it is a real need, a need at a real level, if you will. And it should be compelling to all of us and our political leadership as well. But as the bard said, there's the rub. It should be obvious and it should be compelling, but it is not always by any way or means. We are a consumptive species, and as members of our species increase, populate this planet, we will need more material and the energy to transform and transport that material. Space and the resources there must be seen, recognized, and exploited as useful in that regard. We can't forget that the act of exploring has always yielded technical benefits for this human species of ours. Going back to the moon to stay and to learn how to utilize its resources will also develop technologies that we can utilize now, immediately. Not just the prospect of the development of now available resources, but it will develop, the doing will provide technologies and products immediately. That must be recognized. The need to explore new worlds for material benefit has not in fact changed over the past eons. My last categorical need is survival. I think every technically advanced country, nation state if you will, needs to see space exploration as a means to compete. But I will add that to me there is a curious twist in this need, because there is not only the need to compete, but there is also the need to cooperate. Many times, also often overlooked in the history books, is the fact that virtually simultaneously with competition between cultures, between nations, there has been, in fact, cooperation. If not explicit cooperation, then certainly the cooperation of ideas and maybe individuals. But there is that duality to the need to compete and cooperate as a function of arriving at survival options. Competition and cooperation in space does provide a means for all interested parties to compete, to cooperate, and to reach new means of political and economic survival. But much more too. All of our eggs are in one basket, as my grandmother and plenty of other grandmothers would say. This earth is all that we have, and it has all of us at this time. Here on earth, our embryonic resources are dwindling. Our nest, to some significant degree, is fouling. And it's a target. We need to never forget, and in fact we need to educate many, that this earth is at the bottom of a celestial shooting barrel. Technology can reduce and remove the risk. Useful resources out there can be turned from potential impact with the earth. The products can be produced out there, utilized out there, with the final results brought home. We can look for and guard against Earth-impacting asteroids, Earth-impacting comets. We can place some of our eggs in other baskets. That is only rational, and it is ultimately, I think, only how we are going to survive as a species. Put the anthropological, the sociological twists on that, and an emphasis on that, and I think that is significant imperative, the long-range imperative to continue our space exploration and space development. Those are my reasons why. I think that only the courage of our political leaders, our industrial leaders, those who will put the resources and can't put the resources to the challenge, only their courage is what's remaining to make it so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. That was a very, very good way to wind up our panel statements. Looking at my watch, I'm going to wind this up as close as possible to the noon so that we won't interrupt into lunch and later programs. But I'd like now to open up this to general discussion from the audience and ask you to address either the panels in general, and I'll make the decision as to who will answer the question, or to a specific panel. Gentlemen,
Second question for Dr. Fulda. Do Tom Harris's ideas pass the giggle test?
Certainly mine.
Or about, say, Congressman?
In their personal opinions, yes. In the public, probably not.
Dr. You said one of your 6 reasons was the effect on youth or something like that. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yes, for whatever reason, it seems that young people are much attracted to the idea of manned spaceflight.
Repeat the questions, please.
Sorry, yeah, I'll do that. The question is, would I elaborate on the statement I made that spaceflight has a beneficial effect on youth? It has many sociological influences, not the least of which is international cooperation. But there is a very special effect on youth, which was asked about. And there is this effect that I've seen among school children time and time again. I get asked to talk at schools. And young people are fascinated by the idea of manned spaceflight. And the influence on these young people often is that they choose careers in related areas. And we're getting an awful lot of people who are studying science because they're interested in spaceflight. So I think there are lots worse things that young people can become interested in. And to my mind, this is a very, very beneficial effect of spaceflight that young people embrace it so enthusiastically.
gentleman at the back with glasses.
I'm here at this session by chance. I saw Charlie's Leonard's name, and I said, well, it can't be all bad this session. But I have, I think this is only the second time in my life that I've been at a space-related session dealing with these, primordial questions. And I have a completely different view of the universe than anybody that I've heard speaking this morning. I've run laboratories for the Air Force and for MIT. I know other people who run laboratories. I've directed large programs of research and development in the Department of Defense and the Department of Housing and Development. I've been in the space business as long as I can remember. But I've always been in the applications area. Communications, navigation, position fixing, basic infrastructure. In the laboratories, I always had people doing really far out things, crazy things, weird things. Almost as weird as the things you're talking about here today, in their own domains. It was perfectly reasonable, perfectly acceptable, because they were a very small part of a much larger whole. And as I listen to what you say here today, I'm reminded of that old Massachusetts expression, light dawns on marble head. When you decide in the Bell Telephone Laboratories whether or not to let people pursue activities that might lead to a Nobel Prize, You don't have discussions like this about why Nobel Prizes are wonderful and to be sought after. You've got a laboratory that is doing things that when translated into goods and services in the telephone system is earning its pay. And so you let these people do these crazy things. Because once in a while they get a Nobel Prize, and once you get a new good or a new service. In the Department of Defense, where you lay out tens of billions of dollars a year in RDT, research, development, test, you start with development, and then engineering, and then test, and then production. When you add it all up and you say that's $8, well, let's take 5% of that and put it over here doing things, what the hell? You see, as long as the Federal Civil Space Program was doing what the American people wanted it to do, which for the first 10 or 12 years was to defend our national security interests against the Soviet Union, and doing it well. Nobody gave a damn about what the hell else was going on. You want to go and put probes around the planets? You want to search for extraterrestrial? Nobody cared. Well, 250,000 people cared, I think Leonard said, out of billions and billions. I think you should stand back from what you're focusing on here, and that is trying to rationalize something which in a democratic system using public funds can't be done hardly ever. I'll give you two examples: the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, doing very interesting, bright, they're always in trouble. For the same reason that the Federal Civil Space Program is in trouble. It's not doing things that the American people want to have it do, and consequently the things you want to do are falling off the ledge. I would urge all those who would like to spread humanity to the planets, understand that if you're using public funds in a democracy, that must be a secondary objective, with the primary objective being to do what the American people want you to do. Thank you.
Well, we have 6 panelists. Thank you very much, Tom, for your input.
Since I got Tom here, I almost feel like I need to answer his question. But first, let me restate it for those of you that didn't hear it. No, I'm just joking. Tom, thank you very much for your comments. You always provide an input and a perspective that we often don't pick up on or represent in forums like this. If I might just say something, I agree with what Tom has to say. I think that, however, our societies and our cultures are so at oftentimes convoluted when it comes to how the different levels, and there are different levels of opinion formation and decision making, how they go about that his perspective is a valid one at levels. At other levels, there are, and I think Michael will agree with me, there at political levels there is the need to talk about this kind of stuff and to make it visible, while in fact the decisions that are made don't necessarily at all refer to the deliberations and the conversations about the why. There is the need to visualize that in a way and at certain levels. And while this is one of the leading events at this conference, of course it's not a linchpin around which we turn. I think Tom would agree that much of the rest of the content at this conference is going to be stuff that ultimately will have more impact than the words that have been shared here about why. I mean, the technologies that allow us to do space at 100th or less of the cost of getting there today is ultimately going to be more important.
This gentleman?
Yes, I have a question to Charlie Walker regarding the sense of urgency and putting all the eggs, or keeping all the eggs in one basket, regarding the impact which apparently eliminated the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. We have an impact in northern Quebec and one in Russia, of which we have no date, plus we have an upcoming impact on Jupiter. Can that be considered a factor which would give us a sense of urgency because we can't predict these things?
I think those things should. You know, there's those of us that intellectually think about those things and consider them. Yeah, I think they should. However, in the minds of 99.99% of the population, not only of the US of A, but of this country and all countries who in fact have people who are connected to an education process or a day-to-day news communication system that tells them about these past events, tells them about the impacts on Jupiter in July of this year. They don't really care because it's not, I mean, Jupiter is how many tenths of a billion miles away from us. Those impacts are not here on Earth. The one that took place in Canada 300 million years ago is they can't relate to it. And if it's not today, if it's not in their backyard, I mean, that just is, in fact, I think the most unfortunate part of today's modern world. While the communications, the knowledge of what's gone before us and is going on now is pervasive, the fact is that the impact of that knowledge has been diluted, perhaps by, number one, the amount of it. Virtually everybody that ties in is overwhelmed with information overload. And number two, the fact that our cultures are, certainly the advanced cultures of the world, I think, are so fast driving today that the time scale of the impact or the necessity of impact on decisions is, the horizon is drawn right up to our noses.
Can I add something?
One more
Yeah.
on the panel, then you.
Just on the Jupiter thing, I think it is something you should watch in the media, how the media handles it. I mean, Time Magazine, this is a cover story last week. All I see in those kind of messages is that there's going to be a sense, make the public more sensitive to this issue. I think it's a good one. If more people are outside to watch whatever happens. It could be Kohoutek 2 or something, a bust optically or something. But I think the media being picked up on this is going to help sensitize people to maybe the larger issue you're worried about.
I just wanted to comment on one of the points made here today that really stuck in my mind was when Tom Harris pointed out that the effect of a certain segment of society not being in instantaneous contact with the rest of society may be kind of the driving change in our society. What will happen is that Mr. Harris referred to political correctness not being an influence or a constraint on a space settlement that's far enough away. What will happen is that, at least in the early stages, the final arbiter of whether an idea is good enough or not will not be an editor's opinion or a dictator's opinion or even the opinion of the majority or the party in power. It will be whatever ideas don't get the colony blown to bits. That is very unforgiving and very fair because it doesn't ask about your race, sex, religion, and so on. The other effect it may have is that, as Arthur C. Clarke once said, it will never be possible to have a conversation with a person on another planet. You can exchange one-way messages, but you can't have a two-way conversation. That and the long travel times, especially when we attempt interstellar travel, which certain people I've come in contact with recently have convinced me may not be that as far away as we thought. It will force society to have a longer attention span if we, even to send a probe to the stars where we may not get the data back for perhaps 100 years or so. This may awaken people to or not so much awaken the need, but increase our ability for long-range planning because it will force us to be more patient. And if you have to wait 100 years for the data, maybe you're more willing to accept the expense of providing for a disaster which may not strike in a millennium.
Thank you. You want to respond at all to that, Tom?
Yes, this mic working? Okay, I'll use this one. Yeah, that's a very good point that Dr. Finney makes, Ben Finney from the University of Hawaii. It's my first reference in my handout. that in fact this business of homogenization of worldwide culture and ideas will be very much to our detriment if we want to have innovation and new concepts and new experiments. That if everybody thinks in the same way, the same politically correct way, this is not good for our culture. And of course, as you point out, having some people out of instantaneous contact will release the brakes that are apparently now being applied on cultural and intellectual evolution. And that's, practically a direct quote out of his papers. So I encourage you to look at that.
I was even suggesting that there, in a sense, may be a new, I don't want to call it break, but more constraint. But it's a less arbitrary, less forgiving, but more fair constraint. That is, what works will survive.
Right, because they're living so close to the edge of survival. The environment won't let them treat one group differently to another based on, like you say, race, language, etc. It'll be based on their ability to contribute to the colony. So certainly I think that's the greatest equal opportunity situation.
This gentleman here.
One reason that has, I think, been hinted at by the panel but hasn't been explicitly put forward is one reason to go into space is in order to bring life to other planets and terraforming. So I just want to shill a little for the panel tomorrow, which is why terraforming, to bring life to other planets.
Thank you.
There's one possible answer to why go into space that I haven't heard touched on explicitly, and which unfortunately doesn't pass the giggle test, but which I think may be, in the long run, the most important. I believe that support for the space program has declined in direct proportion to people's belief that they personally will be able to get into space. That as children grow up and believe that they are not going to be able to become an astronaut, that they're not going to be able to vacation on the moon, their interest in the space program wanes. Accordingly, I would like to point out that tourism and travel is one of the largest and fastest growing industries in the world. And nobody questions, should we have airplanes? Should we have tourist resorts? I would suggest that the compelling immediate reason for getting into space is to open it up for tourism, which will then open it up for all the other applications that we would like to see.
I think one of the things you'd be looking at is why the explorations took place in the past, and it has been almost exclusively an imperialistic motive, whether it's private with Homo habilis crossing a desert to find new territory for himself, and that's been artificially taken away by treaty. There's no more acquisition. Like, we don't have the ability to acquire. Like, we can't go to an asteroid and say, okay, this is my asteroid now. That's been artificially taken away. If you want to keep somebody away from something, like with Antarctica, that works fine. Like, nobody's going to go to Antarctica to mine or do anything because they don't have that right by treaty. That has been taken away from us in space until we have the right to acquire property in space. Why would anybody go? Why would somebody expend the billions of dollars needed for it? Maybe if it's a government, why would they spend tens of billions unless they can find an Apollo crossing asteroid and make it the next state? Like, and until that happens, I can't see anybody spending the time and the money to migrate there. Like, small-scale experimentation, sure, but actual immigration, I don't think that'll take place until private property rights are protected in space.
Anybody like to comment on that from the panel?
Yeah, it's new and original. I like the sound of it.
The U.S. government hasn't ratified the treaty. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can go up there and acquire property. The United States government, I don't think will stop it.
There's a great story after the first moon landing. Some guy in Brazil was arrested for selling lots on the moon for $24 each. And he was arrested. He said the reason he was making money on this is that he had sold the first lots to Neil Armstrong and he had gone to the moon to inspect his property.
Further questions? Right at the back.
Ken Money said that he felt we had made some progress in the last 900 years. So at the risk of spending 8 years in prison, having my tongue torn out, and being burnt at the stake, I'd like to come back to the question of the panel, which is why go into space? From what I've heard, the panel has been addressing why should governments go into space? With the assumption that it should be governments, and maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe if 100 years ago, the US government had set up the National Automobile and Service Center Association, we might have had one transcontinental car and be building a bus today. Maybe the gentleman who suggested tourism, maybe leave space to the idle rich the way the automobiles were, and then let a Henry Ford come in behind them, and 25 years from now, perhaps 50 years from now, we'll all be able to travel in space for a few $1,000 a piece.
Just to forestall any more questions of this nature, I'm chairing a 2-hour session on this subject this afternoon along with Tom Rogers, and I invite everybody who's interested in private enterprise in space to show up.
I think this is a good point to wind up. It's exactly 12 noon, and I thank our panelists very much, each one of them, for excellent presentations and responses to your questions, and of course for your participation. Thank you again.